Hey everyone, and welcome to Salesforce Mojo. I'm really excited about the content today. I'm always excited about the content. This one in particular is going to be a huge jump in the direction of payments within your storefront. So if you've ever wondered, okay, well, I got a credit card and I've got simple purchase order as standard components, but how do I actually make alternative payment methods like terms and voucher and maybe actual purchase orders? What do I actually do with that? Well, today we're going to be talking about alternative payments and how to handle that at scale and why you actually want to do this. So if you're a customer in Commerce Cloud or a partner in the Commerce Cloud space and you've been wondering how to structure your data with standard objects around payments, this is the video for you. Stay tuned with us. We're going to walk through the full life cycle of this, the reasons why, and also get hands-on with the code to actually make this happen. All right, let's jump into it. So before we get into the meat of this, let's first start by talking about payments in general in Commerce Cloud. Now, out of the box, we have credit card and purchase order number. And if you've been inside of a Commerce Cloud template before, you will have seen the option to be able to either put a credit card or a PO number onto the checkout page, or they have also a dual payments component where the user can actually choose between one or the other. And those are really handy, right? A lot of the customers, both on the B2B and the direct-to-consumer side, need the ability to have simple purchase orders or credit cards. Now, there's a little more setup on the credit card piece, which we're not going to cover here today, but either one of these are possible with the out-of-the-box payments. But what happens when you need something other than this? Let's say your business accepts ACH or voucher of some sort or some other type of payment method. What do you do? So that bodes the question, what about all the other payment types? Now that's what we're going to cover today because Salesforce has a mechanism for this, but it's not straightforward right now. So the aim for this video here is to show you how to use this alternative way of capturing payment methods. And Salesforce calls that alternative payment methods. So the alternative payment method object represents a payment method that doesn't have a defined commerce object such as the card payment method or digital wallet. So when you think about this from an order summary perspective, you have your order summary record here. You have an object underneath it called order payment summary. And this order payment summary object allows us to connect a different type of payments to it. So if you have an instance that's correctly set up to a credit card, you will have seen order payment summary records being created here. And this allows us to do things like authorize, to capture, to make adjustments, and kind of go through that full life cycle of a credit card. Now, it doesn't actually do this with purchase order numbers. That's one thing I'll call out is purchase orders are what they call simple purchase orders, meaning that it just captures the numbers and put it actually on the order summary. But now we have this alternative payment method, and kind of the end goal here that I'm trying to accomplish with this order payment method is I want the order payment summaries to be created for these alternative payments. Well, now that's not super straightforward because the ones we see are connected to the card payment method, and we aren't able to do that with other alternative payment methods, but we can with a couple other objects here. So when you're creating order payment summaries, you really have a few options here. You have your card payment method, as we just talked about. We have something called a digital wallet, which isn't used frequently today, but is something that could be really powerful as you set up recurring payments. And then the third here is the alternative payment method. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. How do we bucket all the other payment methods that we might have into this object to really get that order payment summary record onto the order summary? So one of the things that we're going to have to do in order to use this alternative payment method is we're going to have to use our gateways. Now, if we want to use alternative payment gateways, one of the things that we're going to need is to understand payment gateways, because these payment gateways allow us to attribute these order payment summaries back to different gateways, therefore allowing us to see what method the user has actually selected. So you can see here kind of a top level description here that the payment gateways are those individual payment methods. And there's really two key steps here when we're setting up these payment gateways. And there really are three key steps here when we're setting up these payment gateways. One is we need to create a payment controller. In our case, we're actually going to use an Apex class called Generic Commerce Adapter. And I'll tell you in a little bit here why we called it this. Then once we have that controller, we need to set up a payment gateway provider. And this provider is this Apex class that basically connects to an external service if it's available, along with our name credentials, so we have authentication taken care of. And the very last thing is to create a payment gateway. And this payment gateway is actually what the order payment summaries interact with and the name that is going to be logged against that order and order payment summary. So before we get too far into the weeds of setting up, let's just start with a quick high-level ERD here to explain some of the objects that are going to be in play. Now, what we're going to be doing next here is we're going to be setting up our payment gateways, and we're going to be setting up our payment gateway providers. So in order to set up your payment gateways, you will need a payment gateway provider, which, as I mentioned before, will need an Apex class to point to be the integration service, and it will also need your name credential here. And then you actually have your payment gateway, which uses the combination of these two in order to be something that you can point payments towards. So that's what we're going to be doing next here, but there are other objects around this. So as I mentioned before, you have your order summary and you have your order summary payments. And you can see the order summary payments has a payment type. And so that type is actually what is going to reference back to what we're going to be setting up here in a little bit. And then on the right hand side here, you have your payment gateway logs, you have your payment authorizations, and you have your alternative payments. Now we'll show examples of this in action once we get everything set up here. But if you do have an instance today, go in there. If you have credit card set up, you will be able to see this being successful with credit card as you go through it, and you'll be able to see all of these logs set up. Now the one thing I did want to just call out as a caveat here is that some of these fields on some of these objects have a bit of a restriction. And so we, as we're setting this up for alternative payment methods, don't have the ability always to fill in every field. And so basically the way that I've set this up is we fill in as much as we possibly can, but in some cases we won't be able to do everything. So now let's talk a little bit more about the payment gateway provider we're about to show here. Now, I mentioned earlier we're going to use something called a generic payment gateway provider. And this is an Apex class that basically is going to be the center of all of our alternative payment methods. Now, the implementation of this for you may vary just a little bit here. But in our case, let's say that we had credit card and we had these three payment types we wanted to be able to support. And we wanted to be able to keep track of them in order payment summaries. Well, what I could do with this one generic provider here is I could set up purchase order, voucher, and terms. Now, the key thing here to keep in mind is that this generic payment gateway is basically a mocked gateway. Right? It doesn't have an external service that is validating the price or validating your credentials or doing anything of that nature. It's basically there to satisfy Salesforce payment gateway needs in order to say, yes, the payment was successful, and to create all the transactions it needs to. So in our case, we're going to set a purchase order here. It really is just a purchase order, meaning we're just capturing a purchase order number. But in order for us to actually get that into an order payment summary, we need the gateways here. So hopefully that's clear that we're not actually going to an external service, we're mocking it, but it allows us to differentiate the different payment types while also getting the order payment summary created. All right, so let's hop into our VS Code. And once we're here, you can see that we have our Apex class on the screen here called a generic commerce adapter here, which we're going to turn into our provider. Now let's just get a little more space to work with here. The main, if you've ever worked with adapter, it's going to look very similar before, but the main section here is called process request. And this takes the request in and it filters out the request type. So in this one, we're handling all the different types we have. So authorize, capture, sale, reference, refund, tokenize, etc. You will only need a couple of these for the commerce side of the implementation, but you could also extend this out into OMS as well. So once we look at our authorize here, you can see that we have a method down below that is setting all the values we need to, such as the result code. We're setting a number for the authentication code, and as I mentioned, we're filling in as many of these as we possibly can so that when it gets to the record creation, we have what we need to create those. But now that we have this adapter here, this is kind of the backbone of the mocking service for the generic commerce gateway provider, we can actually hop into our instance, and I'll show you where this is going to surface. So we're inside of our tiny homes instance, and if you can go to the drop down right here, you can see that we probably don't have gateways on here, but we're going to be using them quite a bit. So I want to go in and click add more, and then we should be able to just to search for payment gateways, and we can add that to our navigation. So it's a little bit easier to find as we're going throughout this video here. Now as we go down to payment gateways, you'll notice that I have one right now. Go to all and pin. I have my Stripe adapter here, which is currently set up into our administration section down below, and inside of our payments, it's connected to our storefront. We don't actually need to go all the way into setting this up into our store. We can actually hop back over here, and we're going to be creating a new payment gateway. But you'll notice as we hop into the payment gateway, we need to be able to select the provider, which right now we only have our Stripe adapter. So number one step is to set up your payment gateway provider. And in order to do that, we actually need to go into Workbench in order to actually set up this record. So once we're in Workbench, we're going to navigate over to Data and Insert, and we are going to need to go down to our gateways, Payment Gateway Providers, and once we find that, we're going to insert a single record here. We're going to need a couple of different pieces of IDs here, and one of the first things we're going to need is our Apex adapter ID. And we can find that by going over into our setup. You could also do this in Workbench as well, but I'm already over here, so I'm going to go over into Apex classes, and we're going to find that generic commerce adapter. So we're going to search for G, and once we're in here, we'll be able to grab the ID of this record, and we're going to drop that into our ID over here. Make sure you take the 2F off the front of that, because that is not part of the ID. So once we have this in here, then we need to give it a name. So in my case, I'm going to give this a generic payment gateway provider, so it's very clear. And we are going to copy that over to the master label and take the spaces out of the developer name here. And once we save this, we'll now have our gateway provider for us. Okay, so that was successful. So the next step here is we need to create our payment gateways. You technically can do this from the front end in Salesforce through the record creation, but I've noticed in some cases that the adapters don't always show up. So if I go over into our instance and go to gateway here, you'll notice that it doesn't always show up where we need to. And even if we search generic payment, and it does actually show up this time. So the little bit of fun fact for you, it may show up sometimes, may not. You can also do this from the Workbench side if it doesn't show up by just doing a record insertion there. But we'll go ahead and select that on the front end here since it does show up for us. The other thing we're going to need is we're going to need a name credential. So before we can finish filling this out, we're going to go back into Setup, and we'll go over into Name Credential, and we will create a new name credential, and we'll actually go through and create a legacy name credential. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just kind of a mocking service, right? It's not actually authenticating with an external provider here. Although if that's something you needed to do with, an ACH or terms, you could set this up for real. But for our case here, we're going to set this up as a generic payment name credential. And we're also going to put in just a localhost.com and as the URL, and it will be anonymous and no authentication. And then we'll save this. And once we have saved this successfully, we'll go back over into our record creation. We'll have to refresh this in order to pull in that latest record in here. But once we've done that, we should see our generic gateway provider, and we should be able to see our generic payment name credential as well. And we will mark this as active. Now here's the name here. So this name is really important because it's going to be what shows up on your order payment summaries. So this is actually where you can create multiple versions of this payment gateway. So the first one we're going to do is purchase order, and we're going to save and create new. And the next one we're going to do is we're going to create our terms, and then we're going to create our voucher. So we're going to create terms right here. It'll be the same thing where we do a generic, and we do generic and active, and then we're going to create a voucher here. And it will be generic, generic, and we'll mark this as active. So once we have this all saved, we'll go back to our full list, and you'll notice that we have our Stripe credit card adapter, and then we have multiple other gateways for all the other alternative payments. And we can see exactly where it's pointing for the merchant credential. And if we hopped into here, we could pull over our gateway provider into the list as well, and we can see exactly where it's pointing. So we can have multiple of these, which is really key. So now that we have the gateway side of this set up, how do we actually use this and create alternative payment records? Well, let's hop back into Lucidchart, and I'll kind of walk you through exactly how this is set up. So by now you probably understand a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish, but you might be asking the question, why? Why do all of this work to get the alternative payment methods into the order summary? Well, there are a lot of really good reasons, and I'm going to summarize 4 here. The first one is that we get the order payment summaries. And the order payment summaries are critical in order for us to properly log the different types of payments. Now, this also requires less customization. Because this is a standard object, we do, of course, have to do some customization in order to use that standard object. Once we used it downstream, there's going to be lesser customization required. And that is primarily with order management, so OMS. Now, if you haven't heard of OMS, it's order management, and it gives you the ability to modify the order post-transaction. So I've purchased the order, and now I want to make adjustments to it. I want to add something to it. I want to remove. I want to add a discount. I want to capture the funds. All of those are in OMS. And if you don't set up your order payment summaries correctly, OMS becomes much more difficult to set up because you have to customize almost everything. And so this is kind of the foundation you need in order to properly use OMS. And the last one here is the potential to use multiple payments. Let's say you want to split your payments up between multiple different types. Now you can do that because you have order payment summaries on here, and it doesn't require you to create a new custom object to store your payment information there. And at the end of the day, this whole thing is way more secure because it's going through the gateway providers and services and gives you the ability to have kind of built-in tracking of the methods and the amounts that people are paying. Okay, so if we think about kind of the long-term goal here, there's really 2 outcomes that we want to achieve. We want to pre-authorize the payment type, which is here on the left-hand side. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then we want the order payment summaries to be created with the payment authorizations and anything else that we want on there. And that's on the right here on the order summary. Now, the 2 happen almost simultaneously or very quickly together, but they are different processes. So I wanted to make sure to break that down and talk about this. It all starts with the kickoff of the clicking the place order on the checkout page. Once you've clicked that place order, the first thing that happens here is that the payment component gets called. And that payment component that gets called has a function in it that reaches out to an Apex class called Alternative Payment Controller. And we'll see that here in a moment, but that Alternative Payment Controller has another class called the Pre-authorized Alternative Payment. And the objective of this class here is to create an alternative payment method record and to update the cart with that record. So let's hop into that right now. If we go into our Alternative Payment Controller, you'll see that it's relatively straightforward. It's just extending off of the pre-authorized alternative payment Apex class and calling it and passing the information in that we're going to pass it through one of our Lightning Web components. And on the back end of that, there's the actual pre-authorized alternative payment class here that has the meat of this. And you can see inside of here that we are creating a alternative payment method. We're passing all the information in here. We're getting our ID. We're creating some generic or some unique ID, I should say, for the payment type. And we're passing in all the information we can possibly do. And then the other thing that we have in here is updating the cart with that alternative payment method record here so that they're linked together. So we have a way to trace back that it was authorized inside the cart. And then we have a couple other helper methods down below. So nothing too crazy in here, but setting it all up in the right order. Now, once we have these records and the cart has been updated, the next thing that happens is once this is actually successful, the order and the order summary are created. And once that happens, now we need to get that order payment summary record to actually get created on the order summary. So in this case, I've just mocked this up as a platform event that we're listening to off of our order summary created flow. You could do this with a record triggered flow as well. Either one will be just fine. But once you have a flow, there will be an invocable in there that we will call the authorize alternative payment method, and that does two things. It will create the order payment summary record, and it will create the payment authorization records that will then be attached to our order summary. So if we hop back into VS Code here, we can go over into our authorize alternative payment class here, and you can see the very first thing in here is an execute invocable method. And this invocable method is taking in all the requests, it's parsing through those requests, it's getting all the information out of them. We're intaking a payment gateway, so we'll talk more about that here in a moment. And then it is actually creating the order payment summary record here. And if we go down here, you can see that it's taking the wrapper, we're passing it, it's filling in all the fields here, so the payment method and the type and the order summary ID, so it's linked together correctly. And then we're creating our payment authorization off of that, so taking in our order payment summary record that we just created and passing in all this information here, so we have an authorization record attached to this. And then we just have a couple of wrappers here as well. The other thing that you will need as part of this, and it will be in the repo afterwards, is your payment request wrapper and your payment response wrapper. So we have all the structures set up correctly. Okay, so our next step here is actually to set up the flow that will create the order payment summary and the authorization record we just talked about here a moment ago. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into our order confirmation flow here, which we have set up against our order summary created platform event that comes standard with commerce and order management. And what we're going to do is we're first going to have to get the payment gateway that we plan on using. And so this is actually a key point here. It's something that we need to do a little dynamically here so we can make sure we're creating the right order payment summary records against the right payment gateways. So what we're first going to do is do a get against our payment gateway here. So we're going to call this get payment gateway, and we'll do gateway down here. And we actually are going to need to do the payment gateway name, and we want to dynamically do this, but right now we don't actually have a field to use for this. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to actually first go over to our order summary, and we're going to set up a new field called payment type. And if we go into our order summary record here, or our object into fields, we can create a new pick list here that will allow us to do that. We'll call this payment type. And for now, we're going to do this with credit card, purchase order, terms, and voucher, because those are our four potential payment types today. So we'll do that, and then we will click next. And we'll make sure this is actually set up against our users right here. And once we have this, we will be able to go back over into our flow. We'll have to refresh it to pull in that latest metadata. And once we've done that, we will do another get. We'll do get payment gateway. And we'll do it against the name here, and then we will be able to do this against our order summary and payment type here. So now this is what it's going to do is if we fill it in with purchase order, it will pull the purchase order based off of the name. If it's pulling in terms, it'll pull off the terms one. and etc. So that's exactly what we want to do. If you need to handle multiple payments, you're going to have to do this in a little bit different way. But today, for our simple use cases, and honestly for a lot of use cases where you're only having one payment type in checkout, this will suffice just nicely. So we're pulling this in here, and the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go to our invocable, and we'll be able to do alternative authorize right here. So it should be this authorize alternative payment, and we will say create order payment summary and have that be the API name as well. And what we're going to have to do here is fill in a couple of these attributes. And the first one we're going to need is we're going to need our account ID, so we know how to map this correctly. So we can come into our order summary here and do account ID. We'll then do our amount, which we can again pull from our record, and we should be able to pull over grand total amount. And then we'll pull over that into the grand total amount as well. You can use these separately for the different records, but for our use case today, they are one and the same. So we'll do both of those, and then we will pull over our order summary ID, and we can find that by doing that straight to the order summary ID right here. And the last two that we're going to need is number one, our gateway. And we'll be able to do that from our get right here. And we want actually the whole gateway object, so we can just pass that as is, like it is. And then the payment method here, which we'll be able to pull over from the actual field that we just created here. So we can go into this, and then payment type. And once we have that set up, we can click done and save as to give us a new version here. Now you can do a little bit of error handling around this, like you might want to drop off a fault path right here, and you might want to do a decision right up here at the top that says, if the payment type is filled in, then go through this action. If not, create a process exception record or a fault or whatever you want to do there. But for the sake of simplicity today, we'll leave this one as is. So now that we've done this, we're getting close to being able to test this, but the next step we actually need to do is go back to our purchase order component and actually hook this in to be used with kind of the pre-transaction stuff we just talked about. All right, so you can see that we have a new Lightning Web component called Purchase Order with Alternative Payments. Now, there's quite a bit in here, and I know everyone's very curious about the updates that have been happening with the checkout page and some of the new components and how to utilize those. I'm not going to go into full depth on that in this video, but I do plan to create one here shortly where I'll go into more depth on this. But for reference, this is using the new framework, so you can see kind of the reference to the checkout stages here and the checkout component base. So I'll explain more of this here shortly, but to get to the meat of this, if you scroll down into this, and this will be in the Code It Forward repository as well, there is a new section here called the stage actions. And in short, these stage actions allow us to have more granular control over how everything is called. So again, I'll explain more of that in the future here, but needless to say that we are getting to the payment section, and when we click the payment button, it's going to initiate this payment stage, which will then initiate these authorized payment. And that's where we get to this alternative payment stuff. If we come down to authorized payment here, you can see it's pretty straightforward, but it is calling that method that we actually created before called the pre-authorized payments, which we are declaring up here. This is from an alternative payment controller that we created and I showed earlier. And we need to pass it 3 parameters. We need to pass it the shipping address, the cart, and the payment method. Now here in this situation, I have it hard-coded to purchase order. That's an option that you can extend upon, right? So we kind of set up the scenario that we wanted 3 different options. You can build a component that allows you to select between those options, and then you can dynamically pass a method here, and everything else after that will flow smoothly for you. But in this case, we're just creating the purchase order one. And once we've actually pre-authorized and we're awaiting for that to actually come back successful, when that actually has been successful, meaning we've done the actions there, then we're going to place the order. And this place order right here goes through a couple different things. We're grabbing the purchase order number, if there is one. If there isn't one, we're passing in a no PO. And that gives you the ability to kind of have an optional PO. If you do want it required, then you can make some changes to this component to make that required, and then just pass in the input value here. We are using refs in order to get the input value. So you can see here we have a function called get purchase order input, which is down below, and we have a ref in here, which is referring to this PO input right here. So we're basically grabbing that value. And while I'm over here, the HTML of this is very similar to the purchase order one I created previously, so not a whole lot changed here. But once we have that information, then we're putting into the input, putting it into the value, so we can handle kind of the two different options here. And then we're passing that into a simple purchase order payment. So if you go back up, this is one of the commerce checkout methods that's available to us. So we're just using that out of the box. And that should return us the fact that we have actually placed a payment against our cart in our checkout session with a purchase order. Now, if you wanted to go into credit cards or other mechanisms here, you can replace this with something custom. But again, to keep this simple, we've used this right here. And then next is now we're actually dispatching the place order. And again, this is something new with this new version of LWR. And I'll explain that in another video here, but we're basically getting the order confirmation and therefore the number, and then navigating to the order confirmation page. And just a quick call out here, I am using the nav mixin here, navigation mixin. If you are doing this and you are curious before I get to this next video, you do need to use both. So there is a checkout component base, and you need to wrap that in the navigation mixin so that you can use both or send through both classes. But now that we have all that put together here, that will be the kind of last step in this component. It will redirect to that page, and your order will then go into the order and then order summary creation, to say, and our flow that we just created will then trigger, and the order payment summary will get generated after the order summary was successfully created, and it goes to that flow. So now that we have all that set up here, let's actually go into our storefront and actually see this work in real life. All right, so we're in our instance here, and we can see that we have a cart with 55 front doors in it, so $550. And once we go into checkout, we'll see kind of the new framework. Again, I'm not going to go too far into that today, but you can see that we have our alternative purchase order payment component down below with our purchase order number here, which in our case is optional. And so once we actually go through this and click place order, it'll go through that component structure there, and it will create an order summary for us. So if we click place order, we should get redirected to the thank you screen here. We can see we have a new order summary with the very first three of JAI. So if we go back into our instance and refresh this page, we see we have that order summary right here. And we see as we scroll down below, we have our order payment summary. Now, out of the box, you wouldn't have this with a simple purchase order. And you wouldn't have it with really anything other than if you're going through credit card and using all of the Connect API plugins. But as I've kind of been saying throughout this, I've seen a lot of instances that don't have order payment summaries, that are using custom objects, and it causes problems not only in Commerce Cloud, but as you get into order management and start facilitating changes to orders and payments and authorizations and captures, it does start causing issues. And so I'm hoping that by making this open source and a part of the community here, we'll start to see the use of order payment summaries more. So just let's do a quick overview of the order payment summary. If we click into this record right here, it'll take us to our order payment summary. You can see that's attached to our order summary. It has authorization amounts here. And you can see that this right now is not captured. So that's another choice that we can make. If we go into related, you'll see that there are records underneath this that actually tell you what's happening about this order payment summary, that this one is authorized for this amount. It has not been captured. It doesn't have a payment with it, and it doesn't have refunds or logs. So we're keeping this pretty simple when it comes to the data here, but filling out as much of it as we possibly can. And if we go into that authorization record, you'll see that it's tied to our payment gateway here. It has some of the details of when it actually occurred and the processing modes and what account it's associated with. And the last piece that I actually want to show here is that we go over into our carts, we will actually be able to see that this cart, which was just closed, is the one I just did, is also hooked into our payment method. And that alternative payment method is part of that class that I talked about earlier. So kind of the sequence here is that if you kind of recall back to that Lucid chart, that it is creating the cart, it's updating that information, it's creating the alternative payment methods here against our gateway, and that is actually hooked into our cart right here, and that information is then used as we go and create the order payment summary. So now what we've done is we've gone through kind of the full life cycle of the alternative payment object structure here. And this gives you the power to really do whatever you need on the payment side for B2B and direct-to-consumer commerce, where previously, as we mentioned, you really only had simple purchase order and credit card out of the box. So now you can do any type of payment method, and you can conform to kind of the standards that you need on order payment summaries. And again, if you ask why, here are the 4 reasons we talked about before that will make your commerce engine more powerful if you go this direction. As always, thanks for watching. Put any comments in if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.